before.
Oh, you do, okay.
Yeah.
And I'll stay as long as my brain holds up.
Okay, no problem, I'm sorry.
Actually, I'm
Al
stimulated
Frieda is
for-
here.
We read the
away from-
Lazzarato 2 years ago.
Yeah.
We did.
You read it?
Yeah.
We read it all right. But Peter wanted to include it.
Okay.
It's a wonderful text.
Yeah.
You know, it's based on lectures by Gilles Deleuze in 1972, 73.
This is The Indebted Man?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He was a student in that class, so this is kind of like a synthetic attempt into a book
I know, brought it.
that was
Excuse
built,
me.
you know,
They're just
30-something
starting to-
years later after the foreclosure
I'm
crisis.
reading it on the side.
Anything.
Oh, good.
Just, I'm
Well, you're
watching the
welcome to stay
videos,
if you want,
but I
but-
would, Mike. I
Okay, but
can't
you got
just
that, okay.
leave,
Well,
but it is
in the sun, I
great.
couldn't-
It's a great book.
They do have increasing numbers of the Deleuze
Oh,
languages
we
translated.
really could have
Very
that.
few, I mean, few,
It's,
but it's happening still.
Gabor
They're informally
Mate,
translated.
Where'd you
G-A-B-O-R.
drop it?
But they're hundreds.
Mate.
Oh, yeah.
30
Right
years,
lecture.
30, 40 years of lectures.
And Aaron Mate, his son.
Uh-huh.
And it's part of the Gray Zone project.
I like Gabor Mate very much.
Yeah.
He puts the responsibility back on subjectivity.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not externalized, it's not
Right.
about victimhood. It's a
Right.
great approach to healing
Mhm.
as well as to
doesn't
understanding
matter
why a
about
Trump
it.
is there.
He said it doesn't matter how much you exercise during work and what organic food you eat. He's like, it's not going to prevent any of your diseases. I heard an interview with him
With
a couple years
Mate.
ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
He said
Yeah.
it's about a structural, how society's messed up. He's like, it
Right.
doesn't
Yeah.
matter if you're organic or if you
Yeah.
exercise for 2 hours and
Right.
go back to work for 6 hours.
Yeah, I mean, he tells a great story of his family fled Germany during the Second World War, and he said that his mother took him, he was a baby, to the doctor and said, he's just crying all the time. What do I do? And the doctor said, all my Jewish babies are crying.
Oh my God. Oh my God. That's terrifying.
All the time. He said they
knew.
they know. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
It's crazy.
Okay, this is tentative, it will be, I'm gonna call and get this for next week here, so I'll definitely be here. And then it's Memorial Day weekend, I figure people are not gonna be here, it's gonna be difficult, I don't know. I mean, up to you, I mean, for me, it's best maybe we take that week, and then we'll go to LIU Brooklyn after that. And then I'll have a schedule for the rest of the time, you know, at that point. So, we'll begin, So next week, what I'd like us to do is to finish the last section of Ricoeur. And then we would move on to, I would start kind of introducing the Freudian fields, and the tendencies in the movement, and, how it was repressed here, what happened, how it sort of went underground in the United States, and then the emergence of Lacan on the international scene, alongside others, but really Lacan and the relationship to Fanon. And I was thinking through a book this morning, African Oedipus, very interesting study by Edmond Orteguez, and I'll point that out in terms of the decolonized, moment of psychoanalysis and everything. But then we'll go on to 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis and see a different level of what is interpretation and what is, the other stuff. Yeah. So I think a good starting point would be to start with Ricoeur on reading Freud. I mean, the great thing about this text for me is that it is really a philosophical work. It's a philosophical meditation. It's just not a description or, a explanatory book. It's really a work of philosophy in the sense that he's very careful, getting the notion of problematic from Heidegger in the first stages, and how are we going to problematize the question of interpretation. And if you remember to go back a little bit, the hermeneutical conflict and, how he begins that. So this is on page, 53, the question of reflection, right? That reflection does not argue and does not draw any conclusion, but it states the conditions of possibility, whereby empirical consciousness can be made equal to thetic consciousness. So for Ricoeur, always the empirical, the experiential can be thematized or be part of a posit in philosophical language once again. So the second one is the understanding of reflection by symbols. And this is one of Ricoeur's major moments, is the hermeneutics as symbolic meaning, right? And symbolic, as I mentioned as well, earlier in this term, has to do with the Greek word symbolium, which means to come together. The symbol itself is a coming together of terms, right? And this is how a symbol is originally thought. Yeah. And he goes back to the Aristotelian problem, which is in Brentano on the several senses of the word being in Aristotle, right? And this was Franz Brentano's lectures. Once again, I want to mention in that context that this was on the manifold meanings of the word being, was seminal work. I mean, it's available in English. Sometimes translated Manifold Census by Brentano, Franz Brentano. This was a crucial work both for three movements, if you will. Phenomenology, through Husserl, who attended these lectures, through early hermeneutics, or hermeneutic ontology, Heidegger, methodologically, and then Freud, in terms of psychoanalysis. So these are three major movements, three major figures. For Ricoeur, and in some ways, I kind of agree with this. You can read the history of modern philosophy, if you will, or from Hegel forward, as the three systematic thinkers, or the three dominant thinkers: Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger, the three H's. And then the three masters of suspicion: Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. So this is a very interesting way of reading, the history of philosophy from Hegel forward, from German idealism forward. And within that, you begin to see, where the problem is really that of, for Husserl, always the problem was that of, expressive and indicative signs. How that plays out, and this is where Derrida gets his start once again. The hermeneutic, of course, was the meaning of being, to establish not only the forgetting of the question of being, but the hermeneutic and ontology would give back meaning, right? And then in Freud's case, we really don't know what we mean, right? But we're interpreting under a certain horizon, if you will, of listening to slips, lacunas in speech in terms of the analytic situation. Okay? And we're interpreting from there, kind of taking his cue from the word salads of the Dadaists, and a lot of early work in terms of, the linguistics at his time, right? That you would begin to read in terms of for da, in the linguistic sense, the away and there-ness of the childhood game with the top that you spin out and comes back, and the ooh-ah of the child. And within this, you would be able to pick up phonetic structures, and you would begin to see the child's appropriation of language, and this would be playing out somewhat in the analytical session. which Lacan reforms into we'll go there later, into a kind of theory of punctuating, or punctuations, in which each discourse is punctuated or becomes, marked at a particular point, relationally to anxiety. So anyway, the meaning in psychoanalysis was always, and the more I reread of Freud and read of him, the more I see construction always under work. I see a change. I see changes always going on. The assignment for today, Narcissism, is not one of his better crafted pieces. It's not the beauty of The Future of an Illusion or some of his earlier works. It's a search, if you will. He's really, trying to dredge up from what he knows as the unconscious, the uncanny, and look at this in terms of object love, libidinal love, right? And that meaning to the narcissistic, type, which we all have. He's really looking here at primary processes. And maybe one of the themes today could be the wonderful child in me. Not the Oedipus complex, but the wonderful child, right, if you will. And I suggest along these lines, if you want a great psychoanalytic existential study, Jean-Paul Sartre's Childhood of a Leader is a great fictional presentation of that wonderful child in us, the omnipotence, the doting, how we are, and of course the parent's desire. What is the mother's desire for the child? What is being put on there? And in this sense, we'll begin to talk about the first level, the first death, if you will, in the death drive, and symbolic death is really to not only resolve the Oedipal complex, which is actually, part of the bedrock, if you will, of the complexes that Freud developed, but really the second complex was that wonderful child in me. Not your desire, but what is the parent's desire that has been projected onto you, and what was that experience like? And it seems to me that analysis is really about this kind of primary narcissism at one level, right? And something that we forget because we're always talking about daddy, mommy, me, in the Oedipal triangulation, instead of talking about how this is formed in us and how this is played out. So I want to emphasize this vis-a-vis narcissism, right? In a way, me, I like energy. I remember I was always, playing, in a sense, so I can see that, playing out still today, But anyway, this is a very interesting, this is where the first death really has to take place, in terms of relation. And Will brought up a point last week. We always have to read in the context of Beyond the Pleasure Principle that Freud is really dealing with, if you will, again, the death drive, and something that is really taken out of a lot of the psychoanalysts' work, not reading through Beyond the Pleasure Principle, but the death drive is so central, right, to the Freudian construct. Again, relationally to this primary narcissism. I'm not a clinician, obviously, but anyway, I do see here some very radical moments, that the more of the understanding of this struggle, this struggle that Freud talks about between Eros and Thanatos, which, as we know, Marcuse takes up in Eros and Civilization in terms of another inquiry into Freud in 1955, that Ricoeur will take it up more in the hermeneutical aspect. Marcuse takes it up more in the direct political project. For Marcuse, the political project is Eros. For Ricoeur, the political project is more the restoration of the hermeneutics of the sacred, or of meaning as sacred. To take the profane, if you will, to look at that opposition that Mircea Eliade did, to take that and show that basement, that laboratory of Freud, gives us, some kind of restorative meaning, right? That we can have ultimately some kind of restorative meaning. So in a way, it has more here in terms of the healing, right, aspect in society than the Marcuse, which is much more a meditation of what could be, a more of a utopic speculation, as you know, right? So anyway, you know, and I think both are relevant and both are important in a way. I don't want to exclude one for the other. I think we have a tendency to rank like crazy, you know, this is better than what. I think at this point we need this, you know, let's draw in the fish nets at many levels and capture what we can and see what's, you know, useful to us now. Yeah, I mean, this is my thinking on this. All right. So anyway, to go back to this just for a second, and this is the transition into the analytic, and the third category, you know, vis-a-vis Aristotle was the first philosophical discourse is not only subject to the logical alternative, univocal and equivocal, for being is not a genus, yet being is said, but it is said in many ways. So again, the emphasis upon language and speech, page 53, number 2. 53, Al, 53. 53.
What page?
53? 53, yeah, I saw you looking, yeah, I was trying to, yeah, all right. So anyway, it is said in many ways. So it's not only the several senses of the word of being, you know, directionally, etc., but sense also is meaning in the French and the German, Sinn, sense and reference, and like Frege's moment, right? I mean, the interesting thing about hermeneutics is you're avoiding a simple meaning through sense and reference, or against the correspondence, one-to-one correspondence theories of truth. You're opening up something much more powerful and much more, you know, I think dense and, you know, and open-ended. All right, so anyway, so he's going to go from this, and the third thing is the first alternative, reflection that falls outside the alternative of only expressing the emotions and attitudes of a subject, right? It makes possible the appropriation of the cogito, and this is very French, right? I think I am is near an empirical statement or an emotive statement, but something other than either of these. So the advent of modernity, if you will, philosophical modernity, and I've mentioned this to my, and Arto's read some of Rainer Schurman's work. Rainer Schurman dates modernity or modern subjectivity with Luther, whereas the French date subjectivity with the Cartesian cogito. And modernity, philosophical modernity, is entered in by the cogito. And everything is really based. I mean, Merleau-Ponty, and I think very rightfully said, the cogito is an institution of the West. You know, the I think that leads us to artificial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. The thinking and the M, that's this relationship. Thinking and being as a dialectic in history, right? And this is the Cartesian moment for them here. Now, he's talking about this in the light, again, of psychoanalysis, because the thoughts, right, are only what we can elicit from the unconscious. The unconscious is, of course, doing most of the work, and the question is always, how do we render this from the first topography? And, you know, we have the two topographies, you know, to go back to Ricoeur's moment, you know, he's going to look at the topography of Freud, right? And, of course, you have the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious mind. That's the early topography, right? And this is where the production of images are. And I would say in screen society, if I can use that term, you know, that's where we are today. This is most of
the
level, the major regression into the preconscious, right, relationally to the unconscious, and this has not really emerged in a way. In some ways, most of the society is pre-Cartesian, right? And which also shows to me, I mean, symptomatically, that we're dealing with a kind of medieval nominalism and no kind of, you know, this new language of linguistic capital that Google, Apple, accordingly are giving us, right, at this point, you know, the Twitter culture and all of this, becomes over a medievalism, right, which is a regression, you know, to a kind of neo-feudalism that we don't talk about. So we're living in this enormous, the gap is not only rich and poor, right, but the gap is really between those that are articulating this, right, all the way down, and to go to your, research on homo datum is
But
kind of interesting.
I think you make
Yeah, go ahead.
an
I'm
interesting
sorry.
point that maybe we should think about. If Marx said that politics is class struggle,
Right.
fundamentally,
Right.
then what is the class struggle today if it has these connotations of kind of neo-feudalism? Because
Right.
that changes everything. The
It
whole
does.
calculus of the Marxian.
Well, think about
position.
this, about everybody that speaks in the kind of the language, I've noticed this from students, yes, sir, this kind of language of obedience towards the vocationalizing and vocationalizing and credentializing aspects of
Obedience,
education. It's an obedience.
Automatic
It's
obedience.
automatic obedience that's based on linguistic codes that are very much more, not dialectical, it's not realism, it's not hermeneutics, obviously. It really is a kind of nominalism in the worst sense, which is a medieval construction, right, in a way. Word and object, that's it. And the relations are not seen. So this relationship is really between these two, and this is basically what's being produced in the society, in a way, right? The screen culture. I'm walking down the street, I'm almost all the way over towards the building on the street, and some person's walking towards me, right? In a sense, on the phone like this, bumps into me, because he's walking sideways, looking at the screen, doesn't even see me, right? And then says, and her phone falls to the ground. Now, you thought she would have dropped the baby on the head,
Right.
Yeah.
right? You bumped into me. You bumped into me. It's all, I'm just standing my ground. But this is the culture we're living in. I mean, in a sense. I mean, it's just one example from everyday life. I mean, no, seriously. Right?
And
I
at
mean,
work,
yeah.
nobody's, in the college where I teach,
Right,
in
right.
the hallways, 99% of the people do not read anything. They just look at their phones.
Well, this is
in
another,
college, like before
another
class.
interesting thing. I was reading a very good article, David Glass's, and he rereads the London Review of Books, which I recommend if you read, if you want a good literary review, it's probably still the best out there. And they had an article on Mark Fisher. And Mark Fisher, I don't know if you know him, capitalist realism, he's English kind of, anarcho-communist, etc. And he actually relates stories. He ended up committing suicide, a very depressed character, but, very good writer, and I think made some contributions. But anyway, he said the students, they can only read one line at a time, and there's no comprehension of a paragraph. So much less being able to read, there's no transition at all from paragraph to paragraph. So here we are at one level here, doing a Georgi Lukács, what is Orthodox Marxism and what is a totality, and trying to put together these comprehensive systems of learning, right? On the other hand, you're dealing with a population in general that cannot read. And this is a problem, to the psychoanalytic mind, And this started, I used to, when I was in Baltimore in the early 80s, I think it was 81 or something, I talked to a friend who was a practicing psychoanalyst. He said everything that was coming up in the session were TV commercials from the unconscious. There was nothing deeper. Right, and remember, Freud's reading Goethe. He's reading the best of the German Romantics, the French. This is a man of incredible learning, etc. Right, as well as other cultures. Right, that he's developing this kind of archaeology in a way. Right, so you have to ask the question about again, what are the symbols? Right, so Ricoeur maybe in some way. The hermeneutic restoration gives us one step, right, in a direction. That's where I'm going with this. Again, to make it a little more political, that the hermeneutic restoration of the symbol is important because we don't have a world of symbols anymore. We have a world of images. Yeah, Al,
I just
yeah,
want to make
please,
this
yeah.
observation.
Yeah, sure.
When George W. was the president, we heard coming out of his mouth primarily direct sentences, but at least they were sentences.
Well, he was
Now-
the product
now-
of the gentleman's C at Yale, by the way. I'll go back to
no
that. I haven't thought
complex
about that.
sentences,
Yeah.
no complex compound sentences. But now you hear phrases and words, and also when I hear young people talking, I don't want to sound too critical, they invariably use the word like every so often. Somebody should write a doctoral dissertation
On
on
the
the
use of
phenomenon of the inarticulate nature of linguistic
You
communication.
should go back to school, Al, it's okay. Stanley's mother got her first degree in 75, so you can get your, yeah.
3 or 4 words like, 3 or 4 or 5 words like.
Maynard G.
Right.
Krebs.
Right.
The thinking is blurred.
Yes, yeah.
Incoherent.
Just
So you make a good point, because everybody speaks in the language of simile, so it's a domination of simile versus metaphor, which metaphor is crucial to psychoanalysis.
Right.
The metaphorics, the rule of metaphor is absolutely essential in psychoanalysis. You don't go and say, I'm like this or like that, and the most famous simile in poetry is like a patient etherized on a table by T.S. Eliot. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. That's one of the great examples of a simile. What?
But you have
Yeah.
Bob Denver as Maynard G. Krebs and Dobie Gillis saying like all the time, like man, like.
Yeah, like man.
Yeah.
Like man. Well, that was the part of this kind of white beatnik.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I understand. But yes, but it's true though, because if you're only thinking if you're only expressing simile, you're not really, in a sense, you're still in this world. I mean, that's my kind of my point. If you can look at this in terms of new linguistic capital, the technology, even though of the advancements that it gives in civilization, it gives this regression, brought to you by Google, doublespeak, Twitter, social media, and all of this. It sets us back into a kind of neo-feudalism, that's nominalistic, and it's not a dialectical relation at all.
Do you get that, the question, are you saying, when you're not saying what they're asking you, are you saying? That comes up a lot too. Are you saying something? The interpretation comes in there, I think. If you follow that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you can take popular speech and you can rework it in such a way. What you're saying, or
Are you saying,
saying,
yeah.
what you're trying to tell me, all these kind of things. But in a different way, it's not really it's not getting to this early topography of Freud, to the conscious mind.
Is what you're talking about.
I mean,
now.
again, I'm trying to do
It is what it is.
political.
Or in the pre-conscious.
What's that?
I'm confused because I thought we said in a previous session that perhaps we never got to the conscious level and that
That's
we
what I'm
stayed in
saying.
the pre-conscious
Well,
level.
I'm not saying
It's a
that,
slow
no, we get to the
process.
conscious level.
Yeah,
I mean, we
well-
can't, no, it's thinking beyond the imagistic, and it's thinking beyond the, yeah. No,
Okay.
I'm
I
saying we're
guess I heard that.
dominated,
I heard
no,
that
what
wrong.
I'm saying in screen society, we're dominated by this pre-conscious.
Well,
Yeah.
it seems even
Is it-
worse than that, because I don't
Yeah,
think
maybe
that,
it is.
I don't think that like is actually simile. I think it's just like a it's a guttural, just noise of nothingness.
Okay.
So probably we're in the unconscious,
Like,
not
yeah.
even at the pre-conscious.
Well, yeah, okay, fair enough. For Freud, the unconscious, the pre-conscious realm is the world, is an imagistic world.
Yeah.
Right? So people still do maybe have some dreams, or at least are seeing
Maybe.
dreams in cinema and other things.
So we're
being
going back to
realized.
hieroglyphics with the icons on the
Well, in a
side.
certain way, maybe so, yeah.
There's no language, it's just hieroglyphics.
Well, it's a it's a
new
language of
of
technology that I'm
imaging.
making, I'm not making an all-out claim, but I'm setting up a hypothesis here in the sense that you're beginning to see a new form of linguistic capital that has emerged from the Googleization alphabet. Google is now called Alphabet, right? Alphabet is
Well,
the
that's
corporate
the-
name.
yeah.
But it's a new alphabet. I mean, you're looking
Yeah.
at linguistic capital, and there's a long footnote, in Bernard Stiegler about this, that the French have begun to study this,
What is the
Yeah.
centrality of algorithm? Because you hear that, I studied algorithm in high school.
Yeah, me too.
And
Yeah.
I got it all right, A+, and I forgot now what it means. Literally.
Well, it means something different
Well, I got-
than what you
No,
were
I was a
getting.
bookworm, and
I got F's in high
I got
school.
A's
And then I became a
now
computer
forgot
programmer.
everything. But so what is the centrality of algorithmic?
Well,
whatever,
algorithmics
I
is
don't know.
now central to everything in terms of
Yeah.
homo datum, to use Artaud's
Formulas,
phrase.
they're
and, yeah.
formulas, algorithms are
I mean, in a certain sense, I think
patterns.
it's sort of like the data is the new God, right? It's sort of the external
Oh, yeah.
grounding of human beings.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
defer to Google for everything. We're like, if I need to know where to eat, for example, like I look at my students because they're the digital generation, there's no memory at all.
Right.
Everything is
Right.
just externalized to the new grounding, so they just immediately consult the other.
Comes up whether
Yeah,
you
the
understand it or
material
not.
practice now is
There's
the
no-
mining of data.
Yeah.
That's the material
And
practice.
truth is
Right.
data-driven.
And everything is
If
driven,
it's
that's where the
data-driven,
grants
it's
are
true.
in the schools.
And
You know, those
computer-
of us teach at universities.
And there's no dialectics in computer science because it's impossible, because the machine can't handle a contradiction in logic. It can't handle A and
We
not
can't
A.
handle a dialectical
It
contradiction.
just stops, right? Or
Yeah,
it starts a new
right,
branch. Whereas
right.
with Hegel and Marx and Aristotle, we know that, you know, A and not A
That's
is
good.
not is not the end of the story. It's not like an error.
Well, the beginning of the story, and this
It
is what
introduces
we've
the
forgotten
mediation
too,
to
is
which
the
you
is
resolve
and the
it.
is not, right? That's the beginning of dialectics.
Right.
Both something is
But-
and is not,
but-
right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is something that's completely, you know.
But this is
over-
not acceptable in modern
Right.
formal systems which
Well-
predominate our social relations. Where
Yeah.
so the computer says, or the people acting like computers say, if something is and something is not, I'm just going to ignore it
Right.
and do something else, or
Right.
I'm just going to choose one or the other. That's
Right.
it. There's no way to
Right.
overcome
Yeah.
the condition.
Yeah.
So there's no like
Or it generates an error.
it's an error and you stop.
So the new algorithms are going everywhere from the mining of data, which is, you know, based on consumer habits, location, surveillance, all of these fields are open up. But at the
Quantitative
same,
analysis.
yes, it's all quantitative in a way, but it also sets up high-speed trading systems, you know, which is another thing, we talked a little bit about this last class, but, you know, the capitalist desire now is to master the speed of light. So high-speed trading systems is a movement towards that the money flow is so fast, right? In such a way that it's so accelerated and so pre-programmed in a way that no longer is there any room, right, for the human subject or subjectivity to emerge in this.
And
So
does
we
it keep
become
the new guy?
driven by a kind of technological determinism. We're driven by this pre-conscious, unconscious. I give both, maybe, you know, maybe the unconscious. You know, obviously we're living through cultural and political unconscious things, but I mean, people are still directed by images, right? I mean, you know, I mean, how many of people that recognize Cornell have read his books today? I mean, to be honest with you, you haven't read any of them?
No, I say, wow, when I
Yeah,
walked in.
yeah. But anyway, I mean, you know, this is image driven, right?
Right.
TV personality, radio personality, etc. Right? Right? Yeah. In some ways. So this is the kind of, you know, the modern Fama is located here, etc., right?
Yeah.
In a way.
Well,
And it's not, yeah.
It's
yeah.
a different, I mean, you know, like reading a book is linear logic in a sense.
Well, that depends, because we're going to look at how Ricoeur reads Freud
Right.
today. Okay, so,
Right.
but, you know, hold that, yeah, but go ahead, tell me
Yeah,
what.
so,
yeah.
you know, and then you have, you know, a different kind of logic actually that's generated by images. And, you know, people didn't always have writing. So, you know, it's a different, it's not it's a different kind of logic. It's not an
Yes.
illogic.
But let me just say this. I mean, there's also a very, very good book, Why the Arabs Are Not Free. It's written by Mustafa Safwan, who was a Lacanian analyst, one of the better ones of all. Put his name on the board. And his claim is that writing was withheld by the system, you know, by the ruling class, because writing forces you to think, reflect, etc. Right? In some ways, and that there has not been this. Yeah. So.
Falling to plan.
Right, so, yeah, why the Arabs are not free, that freedom is there. Also, the same thing in Levi-Strauss. The writing lesson was very important to all cultures, right? The writing machine was very, 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 very important. So to go back to only the, you know, the imagistic, right? Or to go back to the cave drawings, or that we're sitting there in the new cave, you know, looking at Google's language or the 70 odd characters of Twitter, et cetera, is, you know, not thought, right? It's not a practice of the conscious mind. Yeah.
Add some fuel to the fire. Now they don't even take notes. It's take a picture with a cell phone.
Oh, yeah, I won't let them do that. I won't let them. I started racing. No,
You're a
sure.
mean man.
I'm a mean man. A racer, right, in some way. So anyway, I mean, I don't know. I mean, did you want to follow up on the unconscious at all? I mean, it's, yeah, all right. Because,
I think you're giving the like too much credit.
I'm giving the generation
The
too
like.
much.
No, the like.
The like, oh, yeah, I'm not, yeah.
It's not even.
It's not even a
simile.
simile. Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. I can live with that. Yeah.
What is the meaning of the unconscious is timeless?
Timeless.
It makes me think of the unconscious is analogous to the archetypes or the ever-recurrent forms of Plato. Am I,
No,
is that
that's a
wrong?
Jungian perception. That's a Jungian position. It's not a Freudian position. Yeah.
Well, I could have marriage just because.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying, but I'm saying for Freud, the unconscious itself is timeless, right? But it does not create, just archetypal things.
Yeah,
The unconscious is based, in Freud, the emphasis here from Ricoeur to Lacan and other psychoanalysts of their rank is really about the language is, the unconscious is structured like a language, not by images.
No collective unconscious in Freudianism, and so, for me,
Right.
it doesn't invalidate
Right,
Freud,
no, I understand.
but it's a limitation. If you don't have, if you're not taking into consideration the collective unconscious, the collective experience of the human race,
Well-
going back to whenever consciousness in the prehistoric monkeys that
Let's
was derived
look
from.
at how Ricoeur
Yeah.
reads Freud, because I think he will, give us some indications of, instead of using the language of collective unconscious, is giving a notion of the cultural unconscious, which might be, more valuable. I'm not sure. I mean, but I'm. yeah,
Freud
yeah.
speaks of cultural unconscious.
Well,
Is that what you just said?
Ricoeur will enter that into
Oh, all right.
part of the strategy of reading Freud. Yeah. So let me move on. So the as I said, the last one was the I think and something other than yeah. So the case for interpretation, he adds on page 53, rests entirely on the reflective function of interpretive thought. If the double movement of symbols towards reflection, of reflection towards symbols is valid, interpretive thought is well grounded. So it must be said, at least negatively, that such thought is not measured by a logic of arguments. And this is a very interesting thing about hermeneutics. The validity of philosophical statements cannot be arbitrated by a theory of language conceived as syntax. The semantics of philosophy is not swallowed up by symbolic logic. And this is an attempt to go beyond formal and symbolic logic and also the logic of technology. So these propositions do not enable us, right? However, to say positively what a philosophical statement is, such an affirmation could be fully justified by its actually being said. At least we affirm the indirect symbolic language of reflection can be valid, not because it is equivocal, but in spite of its being equivocal. Okay? So then he's going to go on to the three crises. Crisis of language, page 53, bottom of the page, the last paragraph. Right. And let's look up there. This is kind of the question that guides part of the text. Both hermeneutics pose, therefore, the same crucial question. Can the dispossession of consciousness to the profit of another home of meaning be understood as an act of reflection, as the first gesture of reappropriation? I'm sorry? As an act of reflection, right? Okay? As the first gesture of reappropriation. This is the question that remains in suspense. It is more radical than the question of the coexistence of several styles of interpretation or the whole crisis of language in which the hermeneutic conflict is set. We suspect that these three crises, crisis of language, crisis of interpretation, and the crisis of reflection, can only be overcome together. In order to become concrete, equal to its richest context, reflection must become hermeneutic. It is no longer in the imagistic, right? Or it must be proceeding towards the act of appropriation, the hermeneutic, right? But there exists no general hermeneutics. This aporia sets us in movement. Would it be one and the same thing to arbitrate the war of hermeneutics and to enlarge reflection to the dimensions of a critique of interpretation? And remember where I began, we're going to look at hermeneutics and art of interpretation, the two different modalities going on here. Is it not by one and the same movement that reflection can become concrete reflection and the rivalry between interpretations can be comprehended in the double sense of the term, justified by reflection and embodied in the work? Okay, I'll stop there with that. So this is what he does in terms of this transition of the introduction to how to read Freud, and I want to go over this a little bit too. So we have the topography. This topography for Ricoeur obviously is reworked into id, right, ego, and superego later on, right? And those of you that know Melanie Klein, it's only ego and id, going at each other. Then we again mostly id, that the superego, And today we have to ask, where is the superego? That's another question, I think, going forward. Where is the conscience? Look at our political situation. Where is the value of the cultural, ingraining? Does this really still exist as a censor, as a moment, right? This is I think it's an open-ended question. But Freud went to this is an economic topography for him in terms of scripting. Yeah, you wanted to?
No, I'm wondering out loud.
Yeah.
But some of Trump's outrageous statements and horrible statements could be perceived as a type of superego for people that are following him, couldn't they be? Like we spent $91 billion in Puerto Rico as a fact when it's not?
Well, that's just yeah.
Or the Mexicans being rapists and murderers. Is that... It could be like a bad father superego, couldn't it?
Yeah, but that's only a relationship of the ego to id, and the superego is not really working there at all. You just have this transmission of this projection of the president's authoritative ego onto the id, the unconscious of most, who have no idea that he may be lying or something like that.
But it would be an authoritative.
On the other hand, he's very shrewd when he picks up on Biden and he starts calling him sleepy, creepy Joe. He's not stupid. In this sense. He's got that street smart from way back when, which is also playing in ego and id.
Lazy Joe now.
Yeah, it's Lazy Joe? Okay, I thought it was sleepy.
It was last
Sleepy and creepy is a better homophony.
I don't think one president in our history has ever used this kind of language.
No, of course
So in
not.
that sense, he's unprecedented. In other senses, he's very precedented. But in this sense, his vulgarity is of such a gargantuan dimension.
But again, what Rachel was saying, like just means like. It's not even simile, right? This is where we are in terms of the populace that's receiving this. You have to look, again, I think this is very important for the left. We have been in a counter-revolution since 68, maybe 70, maybe a few years into it, but major counter-revolution. And this is a 50 years of this counter-revolutionary thinking, and it has permeated every aspect of social life, every aspect, right? In so many ways. So are we just in this movement of just pure id out there with very little ego, and that this is being manipulated constantly in the public sphere? It's not even like the Bernays, who at least had some thoughtfulness behind it. You don't really need the thoughtfulness anymore to engineer public consent in many ways. It just plays on the reaction. The conscious reaction. I think this is very important, how bad it's gotten. I'm serious that students cannot read. You have students that graduate from college that really, literally cannot read. This is a very sad state of affairs.
It's an interesting, because final exam
I'm being
periods are
extreme,
starting.
but to very much of a degree, the hyperbole can be empirically verified.
We're in a final exam period, so the question is, for the take-home exam that they have to write, how long is one page enough? That's the first question, right?
Yeah.
So there's an extreme economy of writing that they're taught. And the second thing is, when they rewrite sort of essays that are bad, they rewrite it by literally adding a few sentences and without changing any of the original.
There's no structure.
So there's complete illiteracy,
structure.
functional lack of thinking and writing.
There's no
and
structure.
They just add things. You know, like copying and pasting pictures. They just add to the bottom of the picture without changing the...
Right.
And that's what they call rewriting. I mean, many students do this. This is the rule.
Right. Did I just have to add on, Professor?
Can I just add on?
Can I just add on? Can I write an extra
Yeah.
paragraph? This is really what's going down. So,
A major
Yeah.
lack is historical perspective. They have less than no historical perspective.
right.
Really, literally. I'm not being excessively negative. History means nothing. Marxism is based first and foremost on the evolution of humankind, right?
Well,
You
yeah,
have
I
to
mean,
know
if you wanna
history.
look- yeah, I mean, the dialectic,
Yeah.
movement of humankind, I mean, would be better than just the evolution, right, in many ways. Yeah, so, so the problem in a certain way, you're right, but I mean, even the teachers don't have the history. This is part of the problem too.
Yeah, that's
We're
good.
dealing with, if I'm getting this at university level, right, you can imagine what's going on in the high schools. That the professors now at the undergraduate level, at second and third tier schools, and maybe even at first tier schools in some regards, are doing the work that was not done in 8th grade, 7th and 8th grade. So this again is the culture that we're inhabiting. And
Grammar and syntax have evaporated, literally.
well, that was part of a
Literally.
movement that was considered progressive, that you get rid of grammar and syntax when you teach creative writing or you teach writing and composition. Let them freely write, instead of understanding structure. I mean, listen, Freud is a proto-structuralist, Heidegger is a proto-structuralist, and Lacan is certainly a structuralist. I mean, they're really looking at structures of, if to put it in another kind of language, structures of consciousness, in what they're articulating, and that are based on, this elucidation of language. The unconscious is structured like a language, or in Heidegger's case, language is the house of being, right? So you have these different moments, but again, it's language with a capital L that becomes crucial to these disciplines. And I'm not so sure, with all due respect to Carl Gustav Jung, that Jung was really attuned to language so much. He was theorizing and he was doing stuff, but he was really not the most attentive listener to language. He was not interested in linguistic theory or those kind of things during that period. Yeah. I mean, this I think differentiates him from
A big emphasis
from
on
Freud.
symbols. Man
Yes,
on
Man and
is
Symbols was
famous
his
for
autobiography,
writing.
right? Memories, Dreams, and Reflection, and then this thing
And
of
that's worth
Man
reading.
and
It's not
Symbols.
long. It's excellent.
Yeah.
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 Well, I think-
Okay, yeah, please.
I think,
And then I'll go back.
that's kind of a reification of consciousness, but there's also I think you can get a reification of structure as well, I mean,
I'll take my things off.
my high school experience was we sat there and diagrammed sentences all day long,
Uh-huh.
and that's all we
Right.
did.
Right. Right. That's
That
what we begin to
doesn't
understand.
lead to understanding either.
Right. No, it's true. But you can't write unless you learn how to read. This is part of the problem. That
Yeah.
writing is being taught separately from reading.
Yeah.
Right? People do not go through a text. And this has been a movement in rhetoric and composition classes for a very long time. So by the time the student is, at the level of ready to graduate, they haven't really learned how to read.
Yeah,
So-
he also banned me from the library.
Yes, right. So, yes, that's right. Okay, so on page 59 and through 67 is the How to Read Freud section, and I'll look at this. So this is on the way to the analytic, and again, okay, thank you, okay. The analytic, the problematic is the first part of this book, once again, taking his cue from Heidegger's reading of Kant as problematic. How do you problematize a moment? And the problematization here is about the concept of interpretation. And what does interpretation mean? 2, the analytic is really where the beginning of the synthetic moment will take place. So he's going to set this up as reading of Freud, and then secondly, he's going to go on to, after this, to the dialectic, the movement of the thought, which will be the final section. All right. So to go back to how to read Freud, and this is very, very basic, but very good, I thought, in a way. If you look at page 60, he's going to talk about a hermeneutics of the sacred. Right, and this is interesting. The first reading is always necessary. As a discipline of reflection, it brings about the dispossession, this is page 60, third paragraph. It brings about the dispossession of consciousness and governs the ascesis of that narcissism that wishes to be taken for the true cogito. Okay? This is elementary Descartes in a certain way. Suspending of all reality, the aesthetic moment where the only thing that you become conscious of as a thinking self, a thinking machine, a thing that thinks, a res cogito, in other words, is what he's talking about here. Okay, in a way. So, first, he says not to go to the dialectical view at the bottom of page 60. He says we must do justice to each point of view separately, top of 61. We must adopt, so to speak, their instructive exclusiveness. And this is interesting as a term, again, for us that want to be open-ended in our inquiries. Think about this notion of whether it instructs us somewhere, and does it have an exclusivity for this? And then we must do away with convenient eclecticism and posit all external oppositions as external. We will maintain this discipline of thought, and we will enter psychoanalysis from its most demanding side, which is its systemization, which Freud calls his metapsychology. And if you remember, again, when I divided Freud into three basically periods, the neurological medical Freud up until the interpretation of dreams, then the clinical period, and then the metapsychological. Ricoeur is going to do something a little bit different, but the metapsychological for him begins with the essay on narcissism all the way to the metapsychological works. And I really think you should read Future of an Illusion, Civilization and Its Discontents, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. All of these are metapsychological works.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah, of course.
It's a good book. It's worthwhile. I picked it up at a specialized lot. It's done by Peter Gay, who's one of the critics, one of the people who write a lot. And the name of the book is The Freud Reader.
Yes.
And it's very good because it has large excerpts from all those works.
I know Peter Gay. He wrote on the Enlightenment. He was the thinker of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
A good descriptive
He's pretty
historian.
good.
Yeah. He wrote on the Enlightenment and other works. But anyway, let's go back to this, the metapsychological. So this is number one, and this is going to be the analytic is not a self-enclosed reading on a simple level, from the beginning oriented towards a dialectical review in the movement from the more abstract, from the unconscious, right, to the more concrete that sustains the series. I use the word abstract not in the vague and improper sense, according to which an idea is abstract without its basis in experience. And again, the carefulness of Ricoeur. I want us to be attuned to this, detached from facts, purely theoretical, but in the precise and proper sense of the word abstract. And I know your friend Ilyenyov is very good on this, as is Karol Kosik. If you want to know more about the movement of abstract to concrete, Arto, who's working on Ilyenyov, the great Soviet philosopher, as well as the work of a Czechoslovakian philosopher, Karol Kosik, The Dialectics of the Concrete. The first chapter is about the movement from the abstract to the concrete, which is exactly what Marx does in the section on the commodity in the beginning of Volume 1. That is the method, the movement from the abstract to the concrete, in a way. All right, so the topographic theory and its conjoined economics are not abstract in the sense of being remote from the facts. In the sciences of man, theory grounds the facts. The facts of psychoanalysis are set up by the theory, and what we were doing a little bit today, theory and practice in the Lukács. So this is very dialectical here. In Freudian language, by the metapsychology, theory and facts can be confirmed or invalidated together. So there's not this separation between fact, value, theory, empirical, theoretical facticity by any means. Okay, so this is going on. So in what sense is the Freudian topography abstract? In the sense it does not account for the intersubjective nature of the dramas that forming its main theme, whether it be the drama of the parental relation, the daddy, me triangle, or the drama of the therapeutic relation itself. Give me your dreams and I'll give you back your fantasies. And this is part of the analytic procedure, all for a fee, of course. You give me the dreams, and for $100, $200 an hour, I'll give you back, your fantasies. This whole wonderful child in thee that I have not killed yet, right? And in which the other situations achieve speech, what nourishes analysis is always a debate between consciousnesses. Moreover, in the Freudian topography, that debate is projected onto a representation of the psychical apparatus in which only the vicissitudes of drives, I would replace instincts by drives. Remember, we made the distinction earlier in translation that the instincts reply more to the animal in us, whereas the drives are more about the human. Right? And when they use instincts in the translation, particularly when this was translated 1970, whatever it was, that instincts was used for the German treaty, right? Right. This really is equal to drive, right? So it's the drives and their vicissitudes, So, talking about aleatory contingent existence, the drives and their vicissitudes is basically Freud's notion of, if you will, an Epicurean aleatory, atomistic, swerve, if you will. Yeah, because it kind of can go back to that. All right, so in the Freudian, that debate is projected, etc. Yeah, stated bluntly, the Freudian systemization is solipsistic, which is interesting, right? Whereas the situations and relations analysis speaks of, in which it speaks of analysis, are intersubjective. So he's accusing Freud in some ways of a solipsism, right, in terms of how he systematizes stuff, but at the same time, he thinks that the analytical situation, right, itself is an intersubjective practice. Okay? It's an intersubjective praxis. Yeah? Two subjects of consciousness, sort of trying to communicate where there's ultimately no communication may be possible, right? But there is that attempt, right? And, the relations and the situations that are spoken of are always an intersubjective. So there's never really a finality or a teleology, if you will, of meaning. There's only appropriation and restorative meaning for Ricoeur in this, right? There's no teleology of meaning. It's not the final dictionary form, right? I like Bataille's use of the dictionary. A word means what it does, not the dictionary. He writes this, and it's a very interesting quote of Bataille's, right? So anyway, so the topography will gradually come to be seen as a provisional level of reference, which will not be abandoned, but both surpassed and retained, right? So gradually within the analytic itself, the reading of Freud will become more enriched and inverted into its contrary until the moment is reached when we speak at times in the manner of Hegel. We have closed the circle. We have closed the circle, dialectical circle. So Ricoeur is really in process here. Okay? So let's look at the cycles. This might be good to start with. The first cycle is really about energetics and hermeneutics. Okay? So he's going to begin with a project for scientific psychology, and really we're going to get here is a non-reductive, again, I want to reinstate this because the restorative is very important. We do not have this in Lacan. This is in Ricoeur and maybe in some of the Freudian movements, the restorative hermeneutics. Lacan does not believe in that psychoanalysis is a restorative practice. He really thinks that ultimately it is about knowing one's symptom and, to put it in Zizek's terms, to enjoy the symptom, right? So if you're able Ferrari, you're enjoying your symptom, as a director, right? And so this restorative hermeneutic. Very, very important in Ricoeur. Okay, so anyway, and at the same time, it's non-reductive, right? You just don't reduce it, it's the unconscious that speaks, right? We're looking at this much more through intersubjective relations, and we're also looking at it, relationally between these levels of the topography, right? Always relationally. You just don't center on one aspect, like I did earlier for a cultural effect or a political effect of just, focusing only on the preconscious. Ricoeur is going to try to look at all these levels, relationally and at once. And the intersubjective is taking place between this and this. That's the communicative intersubjective relations. And as you all, I don't know if you know, in Husserl, intersubjectivity is very important in the Husserlian tradition, in the phenomenological tradition. We communicate as subjects to subjects, not subjects to objects, or objects back to subject. There's this intersubjective, moment, that is prefaced, if you will, or predicated upon a quest for mutual understanding. In this regard. Okay, so that, and again, what he's really trying to do is give you a kaleidoscopic, or maybe better put, panoramic view of the Kampfplatz, the struggle of ideas, right? That governs both language, ethics, and culture. And this is what Ricoeur is going to do. He's going to look at, again, the ethical dimension, right? And the cultural alongside the linguistic, right? Alongside language. Right? Now, speaking of ethics, 1960, Lacan writes gives a seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis. So it's not like Ricoeur is not responding to someone. This is part of the inner text that's going on here. He is responding, if you will, to Lacan's 1960 lectures, of which he dedicates to his stepdaughter, Lauren Bataille, who was Georges Bataille's daughter, and actually fought in the Algerian War. He dedicated the ethics of psychoanalysis to her, called her his Antigone. And if you're interested in the Greek tragedy Antigone and its modern appropriation, a great, great starting place, at least vis-a-vis psychoanalysis, well, second place to start, because Freud's brother-in-law, Bernays, won the Goethe Prize for a seminal work on Antigone in the 19th century.
That's not his nephew.
No, another Bernays, another Bernays, not the propagandist.
Sounds
His wife's nephew.
I was like, the mad person won a Goethe, but it doesn't make sense.
He won a
Not the
Goethe
advertising
Prize.
executive.
No, the advertising executive won other prizes. Right,
Dollar
right,
prize.
yeah, exactly.
Which was the
founder
producer for the Antigone one?
Bernays. That's his last name. I forgot his first name. I can
I
look it
think
up.
his
but-
name was Edward, wasn't it?
Well, Edward was the
Oh, that's the
propagandist, but there's another, Martha Bernays is Sigmund Freud's wife. Right? So in the Bernays line, they have this group of scholars, as well as the nephew that came to America and gave us he gave us basically Virginia Slims. Right, as a cigarette.
Smoking
The
cigarettes.
fashion item of the
Torches
Kate
of
Moss
Liberty.
heroin, chic look with a long, thin cigarette came from Bernays.
Torches of
This was the
Liberty.
thing. Torches. Well, that was the beginning. Yeah, that was back Chesterfield, Lucky Strike, and all these
He
kind of
wrote
things.
it.
You think about how smart they were in marketing too. Lucky Strike, right? Pall Mall. Think about this. Chesterfield. Think about all these things. Camel. Wherever you're lost in the desert, you go around the corner to the hotel. This was marketing. R.J. Reynolds. Which is Doris Duke. Of Duke University. So there are many riffs you can do with this. So anyway, going back to this again, the Lacan, the ethical part is produced there, and this is another reading of Antigone, by Lacan, and of course Hegel in the Phenomenology in the fifth, right after the master-slave dialectic, talks about the brother-sister relation, talks about incest, right? Yeah, this is a very interesting thing, because what does Antigone say? I will love him and lie next to him, this is what she says when
Her
she
brother.
defends her brother Polynices, right, in order to, I will lie with him, I have loved him, etc. And many, the psychoanalytic interpretation is that this is part of the incest.
Who was the Frenchman who wrote a great,
Jean Ennui.
yeah, Ennui?
Yeah, Jean Ennui. Yeah, it's very good on that. So anyway, so we have the topography, right, and the energetics. So the energetics, he's looking at text from 1914 to 1917, and asking the question, what is interpretation? So we have the economic explanation. We have then the dilemma of the energetics of a conflict of forms, and then the exegesis. And this is all going on page 61 and 62. Right, and all part of the first cycle called energetics and hermeneutics. How do we interpretate the energetic, hydraulic moment? We say, well, let's open the floodgates. The dam has been, opened, etc. That's part of the Freudian moment. There are many hydraulic metaphors, and the energetics is there. So it's an energetic model in the scientific sense, and he's trying to bring this restorative hermeneutics to that energetic level and understand it as part of the scientific psychology. Okay, the second cycle, and this is important, and he's also talking about the exegetical. And exegesis, most of you know, is like letting this text speak for itself, giving you this kind of, meaning. What does the text mean? Is what an exegesis do. In philosophy programs, you'll do a textual exegesis. What does this passage in Kant mean? What does this passage in, Hegel mean, etc. And you do an exegetical 5-page article. So the exegesis is part of it. This was, as you know, part of the church's model. This is a Jesuit model. Big time, big time Jesuit model. Yep. And so he's still using this, right? This is not a dialectical model. It's an extraction of the text, right? that is going to show you, quote unquote, try to garner and extract some meaning in a way. Okay. So the second movement is, of course, the cultural, right? And this is on page 62. And the cultural model is the transposition, if you will, of economic explanation of dreams and the neuroses. What is the relationship, again, of the manifest, latent content, and logic of the dream? I don't know if you had a time to read the chapter 7, but really Freud begins to explain how one interprets dreams in chapter 7 of the interpretation of dreams. This is, again, what Ricoeur is reading here is the interpretation of dreams. How do we look at this relationally to the neurosis, right? And he says, I'm going to have a confrontation, so who looms behind all of this is not so much Heidegger and Hegel only, Heidegger and Husserl, but Hegel. Because he says on page 63, this will prepare our way, right, for a confrontation with the Hegelian exegesis of desire and the reduplication of consciousness in self-consciousness. There's always a double going on between master and slave. Always the double, right, the doppelganger. A topic that will occupy us in the dialectic. So you might be able to hold that thought, when we read the dialectic next week and going into, the next few weeks, actually. Okay, the third and last cycle, so the second cycle is really about the cultural, the interpretation of culture that comes through in dreams, the representation of dreams, and the relationship of dreams to neurosis, right? In its way. The third and last cycle is the reworking of the theory of drives under the aegis or the sign of death, the death drive. So this is a reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. This is page 63, the sign of death. And in this is the field of the struggle between eros and thanatos. And we're really operating here in this culture now with the death drive, in a constant way. To go back to this whole pre-conscious moment, this is a death drive as well. Yeah.
The opioid epidemic alone, I keep hearing it. 2018, 72,000 people died of opioid.
You mean
I keep
overdose?
hearing that,
Yeah,
Just,
I believe
just
it.
from
Yeah.
that.
I believe it.
Let alone,
Those are just reported
Let
deaths.
alone gun violence. What
Right.
about gun violence?
Right.
Every
Well, it's
week
not
we
only
hear
the
another
violence, it's
mass
also
shooting.
the violence of the non-thinking. It's also these levels of symbolic violence that have really permeated the society. I mean, it's symbolic violence at every level of the society in a way. There's no empathy for people that have been left behind. There's no
Right.
empathy. I mean, very few and far between.
No
That's the
community.
way it is. That's the way it goes. C'est la vie. Etc. This is the new attitude that plays out,
Every
and has
man for
played out
himself.
for a long time. What's that?
That's all. Every man for himself, no matter.
And God against all.
Yeah,
That was
right, right.
Werner Herzog.
Or the war of all against all.
Yeah, okay.
Another-
All right. So anyway, to go back to this, the death drive is always working through everything. Again, something that's been suppressed by most of the Freudian analysts, right, want to take that out. Wilhelm Reich, who we discussed, David Glass is not here, and a couple of other people who are more followers of Reich. I mean, I like Reich in terms of his commitment, but I'm not really so sure that the death drive is the secondary feature of masochism. I don't really buy that. I think the death drive is much more active, and this is Lacan and Freud.
He was
speaking.
persecuted, though, in this country. He was in prison, right? Is that
Yes.
right?
Yeah, they put him away.
He's very
That's
good,
right.
though.
Mail fraud.
That's exactly.
He was selling the Oregon accumulator by mail. Yeah. In the back of little magazines, Yeah. Is your orgasm functioning? Right, something like that. Anyway, all right. So then the third cycle is basically again about the death drive, a reworking of it, and also what he would like to do is to take the death drive and rethink this, not only under the horizon of Eros and Thanatos, between the life instinct or the sexual libido versus the aggressive tendency and being towards death, if you will, but also at the same time the reality and the pleasure principle. Right? He wants to look at it in that way. So it's the final theory of drive. So it says the paradox, and this is the bottom of page 63, is that the final development of the theory marks the return of psychoanalysis to a sort of mythological philosophy. And this is interesting that he would bring up myth, in this context. Again, I know we did this last year when we had Jose do a course on Gramsci, did one of Peter's classes on Gramsci and the modern prince. We talked about the left's inability to make myths. The myth of the left has always been the general strike, the Sorel general strike, right? In a way. So in some ways, this mythological, in fact, Marx dedicated his dissertation to that patron saint, Prometheus. So the myth of Prometheus was always behind that of, the early Marx, right? That who will steal fire
From the
gods and give knowledge to the humans, right? In a way. Which is what Marx did. I mean, he basically described the capitalist mode of production to the letter so that the workers would understand it better, and you'd read it in the letters and, et cetera, right? So, but he goes on, the new mythological philosophy, the emblems, and this is emblematic again, and again, he's doing theory here, and this is to work with Eros, Thanatos, and Anarchy, which is necessity and scarcity.
Oh,
Yeah, necessity and scarcity. So, and Sartre begins, by the way, the critique of dialectical reason with a reflection on anarchy, right? Okay, so, and as Marx says, unless we pass through the realm of necessity, right, and we take care, then we can speak of freedom, but not until that moment, right? So freedom is a pretty empty word to most people, that are, that use it so loosely, at least according to Marx, Okay, so the analytic will proceed, and this is a Hegelian move by a self-surpassing and overcoming. So he's going to use this strategy, and I know I keep putting these words on the board, but I think it should be just household, right? The Aufhebung, right? The retaining, lifting to a higher plane and overcoming, right? Moment of Hegel.
That's
Those
not,
are passive.
that's not supersession. is
It's
it?
supersession.
Oh, yeah.
It's been translated as such. Yeah. Derrida translated it as to relieve, to being in relief, that somehow you're relieving yourself of the past by catapulting into the future. But for Hegel, there's always the residual, right? And this is an argument, see, when we go to Lazzarato later today, if people stay, the Offenburg is basically displaced and taken away by Deleuze and Guattari. They're very non-Hegelian this way, whereas in most of the Marxist tradition, and certainly where Ricoeur is coming from, the Hegelian Offenburg is important in order the procedure of the movement from the analytic to the dialectic. Without this, you don't have a dialectic, right? You have to have the supersession, as you said. It's not transcendence, but it's an overcoming, if you will. It's a lifting to a higher plane. So you have these spheres, these circles, right? These circles that are unfolding, right? That's why he picks 3 cycles, right?
So if it's not
Yeah.
transcendence, could you elaborate a little bit on higher plane?
Well, the higher plane is more circular, right? It's circular. It's not elevated up here, right? It's a kind of circular
Spiral.
unfolding, a spiraling
Spiral
effect,
from it.
right? It's kind of like this, if you think about it in images, like this, that the mind is working in this kind of closing of a circle. You close the circle, and you move then to a new circle of meaning and understanding.
Higher synthesis, right?
Right?
A higher.
Well, yeah, it's a new higher
more
synthetic
complex-
moment. Yes, you're basically already overcoming the posit, the antiposit,
Or-
into the
Or we
beginning
can
of the
say
two.
that the
Yeah.
higher plane itself becomes a lower plane.
It's
in
a
the
lower
next cycle,
plane, yeah,
and
if
it
you
gets
want.
replaced by
Yeah.
another.
Yeah.
It really comes from Aristotle's logic,
Well, yeah,
It worked
Aristotelian
like-
logic does begin with a lot
which is a
of this.
trio as well.
Yeah, it's a trio. Yeah. It's the three, yeah. Della Volpe's very good on this, by the way, in Logic as Positive Science, is his chapter on Aristotle and Hegel.
Isn't it also about in Hegel, the reconciliation, the overcoming of a contradiction?
Well, it's always the overcoming of a contradiction is at stake, because Hegel is really the thinker of dialectical contradiction. This is what Marx really loved in Hegel, that he was the thinker of contradiction. And, the overcoming of the contradiction was what was able to move you to the higher plane, this resolution, et cetera.
And that's
The
where
critique-
thinking emerges, right? Because you have to.
Yes, you have to
yourself to
enforce,
invent the-
yeah. Unless you can think antithetically, you're not thinking.
Right.
Right? You have to think antithetically. And the beauty of 20th century Marxism, and to my mind, is that romantic anti-capitalism, as in Lukács, high sophisticated Marxism and the high modernism of Adorno, all these people were totally antithetical to the tradition. They're against evolutionary socialism, compromise with the system. They always understood this. So in a way, that's where the dialectic is. The others are dialectics at a standstill. I titled this course, Overcoming the Aporia. Aporia is a standstill. There's no passage anymore. And where do you go when there's no passage?
At the end
And
of
Artaud is
history.
right. Thinking through the contradictions. The point is, going back to what Rachel said earlier about this preconscious and the use of the word like constantly, is that most people are completely unaware of living in contradiction, and they have no idea where
Right.
they
And it's
are
all- and it's
in this
all
sense.
over.
This is a real problem that we're facing too, because then you can't have dialectical movement. So anything about movement becomes almost positivistic, and if you think about this from the standpoint of the rulers, if you will, right, or the victors in neoliberal capitalism, they couldn't have it better.
Right.
You're dealing with a kind of positivist populism, right, that they can absorb, reappropriate, and take very easily. This is why thinking is important to my mind.
Why Trump is no big problem to
Yeah,
them.
no problem.
Yeah.
I remember there's a great sentence somewhere in Hegel, I don't know where he says the
Manure
core-
of the contradiction.
No, the core of thinking is to be able to confront the tension of the contradiction and not be
Yes,
crushed by it.
that's correct.
It's kind of a very.
That's correct.
In other words,
Yeah.
you're in.
The contradiction is always here. It is and it is not. This
other
is
words,
the
you are-
beginning of the dialectical thinking.
You are in a condition that is but you're not satisfied
Right.
with it, but you don't know how to
Right.
move to the thing that you want to move away from, but you want to.
Right.
So then you invent a middle term, right,
Right.
which
Yeah.
kind of transitions you through.
Right.
So, but the first thing is the overcoming of that is what
Right.
you no longer want.
Right.
You-
So this
you
is
no longer
another
stand.
thing we don't really talk about, the mediation that you
Yeah.
just referred to. What is the problem of mediations today? You know, and going back to your comment about the history, you know, history is not mediated anymore because there is no history. You know, it's all positivism, it's fact-based,
Politics is
etc.
economics,
You know, yeah.
essentially.
For Marx, Nietzsche,
Neo-
and Freud, there are no facts. There are only interpretations.
Neo-
And the
neoconservative-
relationship between interpretation and fact is always working.
Ne-
Not, yeah.
The kind of capitalism that we have arrived at is, in a way, for those who protect it and who advocate it, is the end of history, is it not? What that Japanese scholar.
Well, that was
forget his
30
name.
years ago. I mean,
Yeah,
we're
but-
still living that out. There
Yeah,
are two
that's what I'm
moments
saying.
in terms of State Department thinking. One is Francis Fukuyama's triumphalist capitalism, the end of history and the capitalists won. And the other one is, you know, based on a reading
So
of
you don't
Kojève, which
need
is
socialism
certainly not what
at the end.
Kojève had in mind, at least when he wrote about Hegel in the 30s. And the other one, of course, is The Clash of Civilization by Huntington. So the Harvard thinker and the Japanese guy who, you know, ended up, you know, it was a student of Alan Bloom or connected to Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Man, this kind of Straussian, you know, moment, Hegelian moment, because most Straussians don't even read Hegel, you know, I mean, they stop with Rousseau, you know, in some ways. You know, they're very much against the French Revolution. They don't want to read thinkers after the French Revolution.
They're
This
against
is a
the Enlightenment.
Straussian position that most of them will not. Although Stanley Rosen wrote on Hegel, he also wrote on hermeneutics, and he's not he's very smart Straussian, you know. So anyway, I mean, those are the two tendencies in a very generalist sense about this. But then, of course, at the same time, you know, you have this functioning, if you will, of the economic plan, which was to basically create, you know, credit in order to keep everything going. You know, that we'll go over in The Making of Indebted Man, you know, that this was the new system that was really based on a Nietzschean framework, but even goes further back than Nietzsche, but the debtor-creditor relationship is really what was created here. And, you know, Lazzarato wants us to think that through beyond that of mode of productions and modes of exchange. That's not really where the essence is of this neoliberal, or if you will, I like the term hyper-industrial better, because industrial production is not over. You know, neoliberal is just kind of like a term of concepts. It's really almost an idealist predication is neoliberal, whereas hyper-industrialization is much more materialist, I think, in terms of thinking through the system. But that's just, you know, that's just me. So, but what I'd like you to get out of this is that Ricoeur, you know, from his point of view, and again, it's setting up, again, this confrontation, because Lacan, you know, when we get to Lacan, is actually in a conversation with Hegel always. You know, this is the interesting thing. Lacan against Hegel, Lacan with Hegel, you know, and this Aufhebung becomes a very important part of how the dialectic in psychoanalysis works. And one of Lacan's very famous piece, very dense, but worth looking at, is called The Subversion of the Subject and the Dialectic of Desire. You know, how do you subvert this inner subjectivity in the analytical situation and then set up the movement of a dialectic of desire? You know, so Ricoeur is very well aware of these kind of things, you know, happening, you know, from the reading of Ricoeur, etc. So I'm reading this book in multiple, I mean, as a philosophical meditation, but also a kind of conversation, if you will, with the Lacanian framework. And of course, Freud himself, right? Which Lacan claims he is the Freudian. He says, I'm not Lacanian, I'm Freudian. So return to Freud. Yeah, in some ways. I mean, I have friends that are psychoanalysts who say the Lacanians are totally crazy. You know, they're off the wall. And I'm not so sure about that, but that's how you have these battles that are internal to the field today.
Well, it's like Althusser saying he's Marx. He's the.
Yes, he's the Marx of the.
He's the
yeah,
Marx.
Yeah, the Marx, right. That's right. That's a French thing.
Yeah.
We,
yeah.
We're more German than the Germans,
more
right?
German, yeah.
We have the Alsatian border here is at stake. Okay, so that's the third and last cycle in the analytic phase. So he begins with, the project of the scientific psychology, 1895. This is going on in the first section, if you will, on the constancy principle. Yeah, good to see you, and I'll be in touch. We got to
See you,
get some of
yeah.
that mailing done.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm sorry. Just kind of an aside. So anyway, he quotes Freud here, page 71, from Project of a Scientific Psychology, or the origins. The intention of this project is to furnish us with a psychology which shall be a natural science. Yeah, it should be a natural science. Its aim, that is to represent psychical processes as a quantitatively determined states of specifiable material particles, and to so make them plain and void of contradictions. You can imagine, huh? He was very ambitious, this neurological Freud. This is 1895. This project involves two principal ideas. That which distinguishes activity from the rest is to be regarded as quantity subject to the general laws of motion. 71 out, page 71, under constancy principle in the quantitative apparatus. And then two, that is to be assumed that the material particles in questions are the neurons. All right? So, we are indebted to Bernfeld, Ernst Jones, Ernst Kreis for a careful reconstruction of the scientific environment in which such a project could involve, right? These are three major figures, in the psychoanalytic movement. Two Germans, one who came here and was part of the major part of ego psychology, Ernst Kreis was his name. The other was Lowenstein, Rudolf Lowenstein, right? And Heinz Hartmann. These were the big three of the ego psychology who believed, again, and I'm going to repeat this, that this needs to be strengthened so that people can make unbearable reality a little more bearable in everyday life.
They're not dialectical, I don't think.
Well, they're dialectical, but in a different way, yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's kind of hard to say something that's not dialectical when the practice of psychoanalysis. But the privilege here was that the ego and ego strength could be, And Kreis had an interesting concept, which was the ego in the service of the regression in service of the ego. That the ego can take so much, but then must take a step back or regress to a point where it can deal with things. So the regression itself sometimes is a necessary condition for growth, right? That the ego must be. So he has that going on. Lowenstein, by the way, was Lacan's analyst. Who came to America and built this movement around Park and Fifth Avenue. This was the upper crust, and Bernays is doing his propaganda thing. This is all going on in the 20s into the 30s, etc. And I'll speak more about this, but the major figure on the left was not only Wilhelm Reich, but in my opinion, Otto Fenichel, who came over and had what was called the Round Table. And this was a movement of a lot of German and Eastern European exiles that were here that continued the psychoanalytic thinking and did so where they retained the essays on infantile sexuality and still privileged the libido in all of this. So this ego psychology morphed, if you will, into neo-Freudianism, which was adaptability. We know the system's shit, but you got to adapt to it. Right, is kind of the underlying phrase. We know you bring this great cultural heritage with you, but you must become Americanized. These were some of the, kind of codes that were happening behind the scenes. Okay, so he's going to begin with a project of 1895, scientific thought, etc., and he relates this, Ricoeur, interestingly enough, to the dream things. The project is page 73. The deeper one goes into the project, middle of the first paragraph there. One has the impression that the quantitative framework and the neurotic support recede into the background until they are no more than a given and convenient language of reference which supplies the necessary constraint for the expression of great discoveries. So it's very interesting. Remember, we're reading Freud here. He's giving us an exercise in the hermeneutics of reading Freud. So the more deeply we go into the 1895 work of the project, one has the impression that the quantitative framework and the neurotic support recede into the background until they are no more than just a given and convenient language of referential status, right? Of referential status, which supplies the necessary constraint for the expression of great discoveries. So this is a real interesting textual exegesis that Ricoeur is doing, and also showing Freud's mind at work. And the more, again, I read of Freud, he's as complex as any of the great philosophers, if not more so. This is always changing. You're watching someone trying to construct theory constantly, you know? It's like reading Marx, too, in a different way, but, you know, you're reading someone that's always trying to test out something in the writing.
He was minimally dogmatic. People accuse him of being dogmatic, was he?
Well, I don't know. What
think he
do you
was.
mean? Tell me what you mean by dogmatic. I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, he was tyrannical in terms of his, you know, his discoveries and what he found, but
He always
held on.
He always advocated of further experimentation for revision of some of his tenets. I know.
Well, that's true.
I read that in Peter Gay.
That's
That was
true.
an excellent
That's true.
introduction.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Yeah, so anyway, so the same adventure, right, will be repeated in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is, again, this is where the death drive itself, if you're interested, I mean, if you want to take this up, and I know we're not in, quote, you know, a graduate school, the Yale seminar, but anyway, if you want to take this up more, Life and Death in Psychoanalysis by Jean Laplanche is the best book out there on the death drive. Life and Death in Psychoanalysis, translated by Jeffrey Melman into English.
Who wrote that?
Jean Laplanche, a Frenchman, yeah, who also wrote the Vocabulary of Psychoanalysis for the French scene. And then he wrote new introductory vocabulary as well for the psychoanalysis, because he began to go through his own revisions against his own dogmatism later. Okay, so anyway, let's try to untangle the two developments. And this is interesting. Again, I want to show you Ricoeur work, because to my mind, again, this is first-rate philosophical meditation and interpretation and going on. Okay, first of all, the generalization of the constancy principle and the fact that it is transcended by its own applications. Right? It should be noted that Freud does not say much about the origin and the nature of what he calls quantity. As for its origin, it comes from external or internal excitations and covers pretty much the idea of perceptual and instinctual stimuli. The notion Q serves to unify under a single concept anything that produces energy. So again, going back to what his cycle is, energetics, right? and you know, interpretation, right? Remember this, you know, or energetics and hermeneutics, right? So, as for its nature, Freud simply characterizes as a summation of excitation homologous to physical energy. It is a current that flows, like electricity, right, in a sense, at least one of which concerns the contrary of quantity, namely quality. Which stores, fills, or empties. I went an extra page. And charges neurons. The all-important notion of cathexis, or again investment, as we translate that, was first elaborated within this neurotic framework as a synonym of storing up and filling. So if you're fixated on an object, or if you're, in Freud's sense, invested psychically in something, right, you're storing up and filling, right? So the project talks about invested or empty neurons, and it will also speak of a rise and a fall in the level of charge, discharge, resistance to discharge, contact barrier, screen, stored quantity, freely mobile or bound quantity. All this having to do with energy and energy flows. And this is where, in a certain way, the energy sections of, you know, to go to another text, the Anti-Oedipus, where they begin here. You know, they begin their book. What a mistake to call it id. It should be called it. It shits, it breathes, you know, they're really talking about energy. in the beginning. And you know, this is Deleuze and Guattari, and 68 they start writing. It's published in 72. All right, so anyway, Freud adopts this last notion from Breuer, his collaborator, the Project for General Psychology. Later we should see why we'll meet all of these notions in other contexts, but in an increasingly metaphorical sense. It has been noted, right, however, that in the project, Freud does not go further along the path of determining Q, quantity, right? No measure is stated. The quantities are spoken of as being of a comparatively low order, as being large or excessively large, but there is no numerical law concerning them. So Bartow's no longer here, so instead of data being measured here, Freud is sort of all over the place with this energetics, right, in the early stage. We shall come back to this point, right, of quantity later. But if it does not obey a numerical law, it is nonetheless governed by a principle, and the principle is that of constancy, right? And remember, he's trying to do science here. You know, he really understands psychoanalysis, right? Even though the term is not used in 1895, he's in a quest for a science of the mind, and then ultimately psychoanalysis as the first piece of Freud we wrote, Science of the Unconscious.
He's trying to
establish the science.
As a natural science.
Yes.
But then
that's
he
right.
gave that up. He evolved, and he transitioned into something different.
Yeah, everybody's transitioning. Yeah. Right. Anyway.
It can't be a totally natural science.
Well, look, Ricoeur is trying to do something here. Keep this in your mind, retain this in a certain way, that he is really trying to look at an epistemological justification and validation for this movement, right? He's really looking at this in Freud's claim that it is a natural science. He's really looking for the epistemological ground. Okay? So there is this attempt to epistemologically ground this. And are we going to save Freud, right, from not being the Grunbaum or the attacks upon him as this is non-scientific, this is hocus pocus, this is like some people used to say going to a psychoanalyst in America is like going to the witch doctor, which might not be such a bad thing. The witch doctor may be better, but anyway, this is, some of the comments that went against this as it being a science. And Freud's claim, once again, is that this is a science, and taking baby steps with the science, even though sometimes it may be wrong, is much better than falling back into religious faith or falling back into regressive empiricism and all these things. So this is where we're going here. Think about this as the baby.
I learned a
So
new word.
This is against.
a Cartesian logic of the mind?
Well, in some ways there is a deductive system going on here, but there's also inductive reasoning as well, And remember, you're looking at a mind at work that is really the art of constructing a psychical apparatus. Right? I mean, this is really what's going on here. You're watching the construction of a mind. If I were a painter, and you're painting Freud, you're really looking at all these, quantities and constancy and, all these topographies all at once and trying to construct this psychic apparatus. Right? Yeah. How does this happen? Right? In some ways. Right? So this is,
The word, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Polysemic means many meanings.
Polysemic? I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
The last part, I came across it in my reading.
Polysemic or?
It was either in here or the Peter Kay book.
Okay.
Semic comes from semantics. Semantics is study of meanings. Polysemic, I don't know how to pronounce it. Polysemic, it's like analogous to polyvalent. Polyvalent means many values, right? That's word.
Poly means many.
And but I came
Poly
across the word.
means
I didn't make it up. I didn't invent
No,
it.
I understand.
Polysemic. The semic comes from semantics, but you're making it into an adjective.
Mhm.
Something that is polysemic. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Well, it means it's a multiplicity of
That's what this
seams look, this is all a fancy vocabulary that came out of both French thought, rereading European linguistics from Saussure through the Copenhagen School, etc., where there were studies of polysemy, in linguistic theory, and what is the seme in a text, right? How do semantic fields explode, and what is that multiplicity? So really, in a way, the reading strategy is the explosion into the margins, right? How is that produced, right? This is always the reading strategy. How is this produced through this polysemic moment, right? So this is where that's coming from.
Hermeneutics is many meanings, right? Hermeneutics.
Well, yeah, I went through that. I mean, I went through many levels of what hermeneutics has done.
That's what he's trying to do, Ricoeur, right?
Yes. I mean, it's looking at layers of meaning, but again, his goal is a restorative meaning. This is what Ricoeur's thing is, and that his obligation, if you will, to his text and trying to articulate this is about this hermeneutics as a restorative meaning. It's a restoration of meaning. When Heidegger says in Being in Time, we have forgotten the question of being, that's the first thing. We have forgotten how to question. We have forgotten how to question Sein, right? And how have we forgotten this? Because of the tradition of Plato and Aristotle. The second question that's posed is we have forgotten the meaning of being.
Right.
So the meaning of being is taken up by many, and this is part of conservative revolution in the 20s especially. The meaning of being is taken up by the theologians. You have a whole group, Rudolf Otto, Rudolf Bultmann, etc., Paul Tillich, for Courage to Be, in which they try to take up the meaning of being. I'm sorry?
I was thinking it's Karl Barth, would you?
Yeah, Karl Barth is certainly within that as well. Yeah, on the
Martin
Epistle to the
Buber.
Romans, a
What about Martin
beautifully
Buber?
written book.
I and Thou.
Martin Buber could be considered that in another way. Yes, of course. All of these people were part of the theological and open theological reading, right, in many ways. On the other hand, you had a group of people that were secularized, that wanted to take hermeneutics up as an appropriation of, quote, understanding cultural value, cultural meaning. Some of the anthropologists did this. Then you have the questions of ethics. Within this ethos of meaning, do we begin with ethos always, and et cetera? And then, of course, people like Fred Jameson, the political unconscious. How are we going to do a hermeneutics, right? A meaning of the political unconscious. That's a meditation. There are two major meditations on interpretation, maybe three, but for our purposes right now, the Ricoeur on Freud on interpretation, and then Jameson about close to 20 years later, the political unconscious, the first chapter, which is a long meditation on interpretation. So, and Ricoeur wants to go back to a restorative meaning, whereas for Jameson, it's more of an academic exercise, how to open up heuristics, right, for study. So you read St. Augustine as a political unconscious during the period of the City of God, and how do you do this alongside the mode of production that's operative, in early, late in the beginning of the empire? What was his role? How do you write history is really the question here, ultimately, right? How do you write history that has some meaning? So all this is about the conflict of interpretation, the conflicts of forces of interpretation. And Freud, for Ricoeur, Marx, and Nietzsche all become the masters of suspicion. They do not really think there is any kind of, quote, final meaning. There is no teleology of meaning, etc., right? So he's trying to investigate how Freud got to this point, right, and how it continued to go. At the same time, looking at, is there a justification for this as an epistemological, can this be justified as a science, as a natural science? So he's caught in between, if you will. The project is to think this through. Is psychoanalysis part of the natural sciences, right? Or is it simply, ultimately put, or more simply put, just the art of interpretation, right? Is it an art, right? And not a science. Or in every science, is there an art? I mean, these are all questions that are going on, in a sense. Are the best surgeons those that are not the mechanics who just perform 150 operations and they may get a little bit skilled, or is it the surgeon as an artist who knows what to do in the case he sees something different on the spot and can laterally use, the radical imagination in a certain way. So we're dealing with, the questions of science and imagination, science and epistemological verifiability, so in a way, this is a grand defense of Freud, right? Both epistemologically and interpretively. At the same time, it's maybe trying to show the limitations, and it is a kind of, in a political way, I think for our purposes, even though Ricoeur is a Catholic, right? He's a believer, he's a theologian.
Did he remain Catholic?
Yeah, I think so. But anyway, all to say, he was never a leftist, right? But in a way, can we use such a concept as restorative meaning, right, in some ways, in a world where meaning is very hard to come by, right? I mean, you pointed out 72,000 deaths by opioids alone, right? The gun violence, what's really going on. So are we in need? Is this a necessity that we're, trying to think? So these are the things I struggle with, as questions, and, something that we should, begin to, consider. So I don't eliminate, I know people, that read this and said, Ricoeur's a Catholic, it's not so, there's much more here, in a way. And I think you're also in the presence of seeing how a really good philosophical meditation on a major figure would work, how you would move from, quote unquote, how you problematize the mode of reading, right? How do you read? And secondly of all, how you move from analytic, abstract, to concrete, and then how do you move from that analytic, and use another term, the transition, to the dialectic, and how that movement plays out. So I think we can learn a lot, both formally for the construction of the text as well as its content, part of my justification. So let me go on just 2 minutes, and then we'll pick up, you gotta go, okay, thank you, Ryan, yeah. So let me just point out a couple of things real quickly. I don't know. I'm going to have to go find out. I'm sorry. But let me just close up with a couple of things, and then we'll pick this up next week definitely, and we'll go to the Freud Narcissism. I've got a lot of pointers on it, so if you don't mind rereading, this is a very difficult and a kind of shaky piece, the Narcissism. The James Strachey translation, but it's online. Josh, found it and put it up, so you can just get it online. And I was going to talk about this vis-a-vis both Jung and Adler, as well as some of the problems in this, and then how later it was resolved and talked about, and what the Lacanian or the Henri Vallon mirror stage had to do with this, and how Lacan reworks it too.
I have a quick question.
Yeah,
The
sure.
first reading, I think, was called The Unconscious.
Yes.
But that whole thing is in Peter Gay, and so is Narcissism. That's why it's a good,
okay.
it's
So
a good
people can buy
anthology,
that.
but-
I don't have
No,
that. I have.
no, I mean,
I have
it's
copies of
practical
standard
to anyone
edition.
who's that interested
Yeah,
in Freud.
yeah. Who's the translator? Do you remember?
I don't remember, but
Okay, because the translation
I got
problem is
I got it
always
from a
important.
specialized library, from the Carl Jung Library.
Okay,
It was there.
okay, good.
I was
All right,
glad.
well, let me just point out a couple of things here. If you look, another thing I want you to look at, the topography, he begins this in the first section. Chapter 2 begins energetics and hermeneutics in the interpretation of dreams. So maybe we'll pick up with that next time about the fulfillment, wish fulfillment, right? Dream work and how you interpret a dream, and the work of condensation and displacement, page 93 and 95. And different investments of energy that are going on. And then to go forward a little bit, the narcissism, how he begins on page 127. So if you read this alongside, I think it'll deepen your understanding of Freud's on narcissism. Page 127 of the Ricoeur is the beginning of his study of the essay on narcissism. Which is 1914, crucial essay for Freud, crucial in terms of the turn, if you will, in Freudian thinking. Okay, so then he goes on to the next part about the analogy of dreams. This begins on page 159, and the ways of interpretation pages 186 and following going forward. So we'll pick up with that next week, and then if you have time, you can read a little further. Shouldn't be finished the analytic, and if you have a chance to start going into dialectic and ask the question, what is reality? Which is a very obviously deep question.
Is Peter coming or not?
Peter's coming and Bruno's coming.
Oh,
Yeah,
Bruno.
yeah. But I don't know if they're down here or upstairs. Yeah, so I'm gonna find out. So thank you so much, and we'll close it up here. Yeah.
Here you go, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you. Nice to see you, man.